Okay, let's talk about typography, which is one of my favorite topics. I think I mentioned in my intro at the very beginning of class that I wrote my master's thesis about typography, and I do love letters and fonts a lot. So typography, it's more than just letters, of course. It's also about aesthetics. Joanna Drucker, a very famous graphic design author, calls typography the character of characters, meaning that typography has emotion and gives personality, gives a voice to what you're trying to say with type. Scott Ferrand, who works here at the University of South Carolina, says that one of the primary functions of type is to bring the extension of the spoken word to the typed content. So legibility is number one, but certainly the personality, the mood, the tone that different typefaces can communicate is really important to visual communications. And I want to start out by showing you all a quick video that, I don't know, I guess it gives an appreciation for desktop publishing and creating type and using type on the computer, as opposed to what it was, I don't know, several decades ago, many decades ago, as a matter of fact. And this video is about letterpress. And I was really fortunate in when I was getting my master's degree and doing that thesis on typography, I got to use a letterpress as part of my training and really enjoyed it. And it very much gave me an appreciation for typing on the computer, because as you'll see in this short video, I won't play all of it, typography used to be really tedious in that you had to lay down every single letter and it was upside down and backwards, and it was just a labor-intensive process. So let's watch just a little bit of this very short documentary on letterpress.
Pull out the one below halfway. Then pull out your case far enough to reach the back row of boxes.
My name's Paul Collier. I'm the letterpress and typography technician at the University of Plymouth. Letterpress is an old form of mass production, an old form of printing, invented around about 1450s by Johannes Gutenberg. This workshop tends to work in the same way as it did back in that time. So by using these pre-molded, reusable letters and made of metal and wood, movable type, we can produce words and sentences and paragraphs and pages of text.
Okay, I think I'll stop it there because you kind of get the general idea of what it was like to lay out a page of text prior to computer publishing. Again, everything was upside down and backwards. You had to adjust the spacing between the letters using little bits of lead. You had to adjust the spacing between lines of characters, also using lead. That's why adjusting those is called leading. We'll talk about that very soon. And you had to use these things called furniture, like bits of wood or other materials that would hold everything in place so that when you inked your type and rolled the paper over it, it didn't go all over the place. At the very beginning of the film, you probably saw that that guy was opening and closing cases to pick out the letters that he needed. And that's where the terms uppercase and lowercase came from. So your capitals were on top and your lowercase letters were on the bottom case. So really fun to do. I definitely recommend it if you ever have the chance to do it, but not something I would want to have to do every time I had to type something up. Let's talk about the different kinds of typeface groupings. And there are different ways that people categorize them, but I'm going to break it down basically into 5 for you all. So serif refers to typefaces that have these little brackets on them. These are all serif typefaces, and we'll talk about those and all of them in just a moment here. Sans serifs are those without the little brackets. Black letter is going to be very old-fashioned. Then we have script, like cursive, and more decorative typefaces. And some people would add modern type and slab serif type. So I'll just briefly touch on those as well. So serifs, as you can see, they are the ones with these little brackets. They are most legible when they're on paper. They're traditional, they tend to be more authoritative. They have a thick to thin, what's called stress here. So see how the letter gets thin here? That's called stress. And it can be vertical or diagonal. This is a typeface that is most readable. It tends to work best in long paragraphs of type, again, especially on paper. On screens, often a sans serif actually works a little bit better. So these brackets that you see, I hope you all can see what I'm talking about. We'll be able to see it better on a different screen, a different slide. But there are a couple of theories about why those came about. The most commonly thought theory is that back when type was chiseled in stone, sometimes they would actually use their chisel to bracket the ends of the letters so that they didn't continue cracking. But the serifs are also thought to lead the eye from one letter to another, aiding in readability. Sans serifs, that's these down here. This, of course, up here is still a serif on the title, but all of these are lacking a serif, the bracket being called a serif. They're most legible on screens, typically. They tend to be more contemporary, they're bolder, they're more simple, and usually, but not always, they have a more uniform thickness. They don't have that stress that we saw with the serif typefaces. And they tend to be a little less formal than serif. These are black letter typefaces, and they're ornate and dramatic, and they tend to look really authoritative and credible. And this was developed in Europe in the 11th century and used for many, many centuries after that. Now it's pretty difficult to read. We're not used to that, but it was developed at the time to kind of mimic the way that the things had been handwritten, long before that. So like the way the monks were writing and writing manuscripts, really super ornate. So the fact that this is really old and it's been used for a long time, as I said, gives it an air of authenticity and authority. So we see it on things like newspapers that want to come across as established and authoritative. And you'll also see this, hopefully, soon or in a few years on your diploma. Lots of different kinds of scripts, probably hundreds and hundreds of them online for free. They can work in small bits, but you don't want to write an entire paragraph in a script. It's, can be either really casual or really formal, depending on what kind of script it is. It's really dramatic. It's, supposed to mimic handwriting. So you want to use it in small doses, maybe for like a headline or something, but use this sparingly. Same with, decorative or novelty typefaces that are just really over the top, that you can also find on all kinds of free online type outlets or on Google Fonts or something like that. I almost advise against these entirely. I think that they tend to be pretty tacky and a little too much, but maybe in the right context they would work. So how do we pair typefaces? There's not really a super correct answer on this, but the big thing here is that you want to have contrast. So you don't want to have, for example, Garamond with Times New Roman, because those are both really relatively similar-ish serif typefaces, and they look just different enough that it might bother the reader and kind of, say, well, why do these look a little bit different? If you want to pair typefaces, you really want to make them very, very different. So like a serif with a sans serif. like a really decorative typeface if you need to do that on a headline, with a more neutral readable typeface, or a serif for your paragraphs. You don't want to mix moods. You don't want to have like Comic Sans with Garamond. Actually, I don't think you should use Comic Sans ever, but you get the idea. You can also use type that's in the same family. Type family meaning something like Times New Roman, regular, italic, and bold. That's a type family, and we'll have a slide on that soon. And there are a number of websites out there that will help you with pairing fonts. So definitely, if you're doing that, make use of those resources. Just choosing typefaces in general, you want to do some research to kind of figure out what the best way to do that, or the best typefaces to use and what they are. So if you're going for something like clean and slick and modern, you want to look at typefaces from the modern era. High-end fashion brands might use something that is really timeless and elegant, or maybe use high contrast typefaces with smooth curves or something like that. So you want to do some research about what are you trying to communicate and what typefaces have historically been used for that, especially if you're trying to harken back to a certain era or communicate something with nostalgia. So you want to look closely at the letters and think about the personality of the type and the tone of the type. All right, so this is anatomy of different letters, and the ones that I have circled are the ones that I might quiz you on or test you on, but there are just so many different terms here that I don't want to get bogged down on every single one of these. But let's go through a few. So cap height refers to the distance between the baseline, which is where letters sit, and the top of a capital letter. That's called cap height. Here is that serif that we were talking about, little bracket. A bold refers to like the P here, where it has some space in between. The O could also be considered to have a bold. The G has a bold. So enclosed space within a letter. As I said, the baseline is where all letters sit, although some go below the baseline. An ascender is when a letter goes above what's called the mean line. The mean line is the height of a lowercase letter. And so anything that goes above that is an ascender. So of course the H, the L, and without having the alphabet in front of me, I can't think of anything else. But that's an ascender. And conversely, anything that goes below this baseline is called a descender. So G, J, Y, those letters. We did already talk about stress, and that's when a letter that usually is a serif gets thinner. Typically stress is vertical or diagonal. Looks kind of funny if it's horizontal. So those are the big elements of letters themselves, the anatomy of letters that I want you to concentrate on. Other glyphs. So when I say the word glyph, I'm referring to letters, numbers, ligatures, basically anything, including dingbats, that you can type with a keyboard. So any character really is a glyph. So it's not only letters, but things like swashes. For some reason, I put lots of swashes on this slide because I like them. But also, dingbats, numbers, and I want to point out the difference between regular numbers and old style numbers, or figures they're called. And these you can see adjust where they are on the mean line so that the letters fit together really nice. The numbers, excuse me. And I love using old style figures when I am doing things like statistics or anything really type heavy. And ligatures, so sometimes there are two different characters that want to collide into each other. So for example, look at the F and the I here. They are not, they're kind of running into each other, but there's tension there. Same with the F and the L, here and here. So ligatures are characters where they combine them together because they want to go together, and do that in a nice clean way instead of having that tension there. So that's a ligature. I already mentioned the idea of type families. So again, that's something like a Roman or regular, an italic, a bold, and just like regular families, hopefully, they usually go well together. They get along well. Some typefaces have really huge families, and some just have those three. Leading is the space between baselines of type. And we've talked about, never going with a default, and that is the case with leading. You almost always want to increase the leading when you are writing paragraphs of type. And at the same time, if you have a headline, also called display type, that's more than one line, so a 2-line headline, you probably want to decrease that leading. And the reason for doing that is because it's all about readability. So in small type, as you might find in a paragraph, because it's small, the reading is going to be impaired a little bit. And you can compensate for that by adding some leading. Conversely, on a headline that's going to be nice and big, it's very nice and readable, you can take that down quite a bit. And as I mentioned before, leading typically back in the day was actual strips of lead between lines of type. Talk about tracking and kerning as well. And once you notice tracking and kerning and bad tracking and kerning, it's kind of hard to not notice it, and it'll drive you nuts as you look at things like signs and menus. All right, so tracking refers to adjusting the spaces between all of the letters in a word or a paragraph. So if you see a typeface that just looks really, really tight, like the letters are way too tight together or way too far apart, you can adjust the tracking, and that does everything. Kerning refers to adjusting spacing between specific pairs of letters. And there are some letters that tend to be more problematic than others. For example, slanted letters, like V's and W's, they tend to need adjusting more, like the W and the A here. That would be a common one, or a Y. Bringing those things together. You want your letters to kind of fit together nicely. Another common place where you will need to adjust the kerning, usually you're tightening the kerning. It's not too often that you're widening the kerning, but the first letter in a sentence where there's a capital followed by a lowercase letter, it's really common that you would need to adjust or tighten the kerning there. So when might you use something like generous leading or spacious leading or spacious kerning or tracking? When would you want your letters really far apart or your lines really far apart? Well, we talked about readability, of course, but we also talked about tone and mood and personality being communicated through typography. So if you have something that you want to communicate, like airiness or lightness, maybe it's like a spa or something, you might use like really loose and generous tracking or kerning or leading to give that, to communicate that visually. This kind of falls under the category of a thou shalt not of typography, but let me go ahead and give you these terms. Widows and orphans, this refers to a line that's either at the very end of a paragraph or the very beginning of a paragraph. That's just one word. You usually don't want to leave one word hanging at the beginning or the end of a paragraph. So think of an old man or woman, a widow. They're alone at the end of their lives. And so that's why we call the widow, call a word at the end of a paragraph a widow. And conversely, an orphan would be someone who is alone at the beginning of their life. So if you see a word that is all alone at the beginning of a paragraph, that's an orphan. And we'll talk more about how to accommodate for those, how to adjust for those using software. But you can also just manually do that with what's called a soft return, or just hitting return so that another word joins the lonely widow word. Justified rivers also falls under the heading of a thou shalt not, and you can see it right there. You've probably all had an instance where you've opened up a book and you've seen like this long empty space. That's called a justified river, and it happens when you have force justified text. In other words, you have a paragraph of type that is set to be flush on both the right and the left. Maybe you'd see that in like a newspaper or something. And the way they make it line up on the right and the left is by adjusting the space between words. And if you have big awkward spaces, you'll often get these justified rivers. Alignment, when it comes to type, typically we're going to use flush left. That's the default on like Microsoft Word if you're writing a paper. And that's also called ragged right, because the rag, or the part that is not nice and aligned, is that's called a rag, the part that's not nice and aligned on the right. You can also use flush right and ragged left. Justified or force justified, again, is that lined up on the right or left, which I often don't really love. But when to use which? So here we see a justified left, rag right paragraph, and it's next to, let's say this is a photograph or a shape of some kind, and that will result in some trapped space. Here, some awkward space. So if you have type that's going up against a photograph on the right, that's an occasion where you might actually want to use a justified right typography and a ragged left, because then you get this clean line. And we talked about directing your white space to the edge of the page, and that's what you're doing here. By the way, right here, this INUS, that is a widow. And of course, if you have a photograph that's to the left, then you can flush left your type and ragged right. So that is directed to the outside of the page. And of course, this is the most common way of formatting type. Just briefly, I want to talk about what I call finessing your type or designing your type. Never go with the default of anything. Again, when we're designing, we're not writing. We're not writing a paragraph or a book report. We're designing. So we should design out our headlines, again, also called display type. And design your paragraphs. Spend a lot of time on them. So here are a few great examples, and you can notice that the headline is not necessarily placed where Bill Gates on Microsoft Word wants you to place it. It's not on the top left-hand corner. It's, sometimes the headline is at the bottom or diagonal or on the right side of the page. And all of these are really designed out, and a lot of time has been spent just on the type, on the headline. Let's talk about a few more thou shalt nots real quick. In terms of typography specifically, stroked text, which is basically just text that is outlined, tends to be really difficult to read. All caps, with the exception of display type, but certainly never write a paragraph in all caps. That's very difficult to read. Lowercase letters are designed to be readable. Now, you don't want to underline your type for emphasis. There are other ways to emphasize your type. Italics. You don't want to use italics for emphasis either. You want to use italics for proper titles or for quotes. You don't want to use a whole bunch of typefaces. You usually want to use just 2 typefaces, 3 at the very most, maybe just 1. But we talked about pairing, 2 very high contrast typefaces. There are certain typefaces that have sort of become a joke in the graphic design industry. Zapfino being one, Papyrus, Comic Sans, and then just, overdoing it with the decorativeness. Also, stacked type is kind of a thou shalt not in the design world. If you need to have vertical type, instead of stacking it like this, you would just take the whole line of type and put it vertical, I guess. I should have given an example of that here and I didn't, but hopefully you can kind of imagine what I'm referring to. So here you can see our example of a brochure that was not designed very well, and the stroked type and how that's very difficult to read. Another thing that's a thou shalt not, almost always, is colored type on a colored background. So you either want colored type on a black or white background, or black or white type on a colored background. Contrast is always really important. If you have color on color in terms of typography, it often appears to kind of vibrate, and it's just really difficult to read. And that's it for this slideshow on typography, the basics of typography. I'll have some supplementary materials about type, but I hope you can nerd out on this topic as much as me, or half as much as me.